joined us today for our amazing upcoming webinar. Before we launch into it, I'd like us to take a moment of silence to just acknowledge the senseless violence that we've seen over the last couple of weeks. Unfortunately, as a country born out of violence, violence is a part of our culture. And as we move through our conversations today, I ask that we reflect on who we have been, but also to reflect on who we want to become into the future, and that we commit ourselves to doing that work every day, day after day, until it becomes true. Our sector in philanthropy has a unique and privileged opportunity to be well-resourced and well-connected. And with that privilege, I believe that we have a responsibility to commit ourselves to the diligent work of modeling and building the type of world we want to live in. At Kataly, we understand that how we do our work and how we engage with our grantees and our partners is just as important as the work itself. And the how, the way of being, is how we as individuals allow ourselves to be transformed through the work as well. So with today's webinar, we attempt to share what we are learning about the how we go about doing our work, so that we as a field in philanthropy, those of us that have access to the resources and the connections, can show up to support the communities that are unfortunately hit first and worst by events that we're experiencing. And so to transition into our webinar, in the fall, we started hosting a series of webinars that focused in on our programmatic work. You had the opportunity to hear from our Environmental Justice Resourcing Collective, the Mindfulness and Healing Justice Program, and our Restorative Economies Fund. Programmatic work is discussed a lot in philanthropy. We hear about it constantly. And it makes sense, right? And what we know to be true is that how we go about redistributing the resources that we have access to, that we steward, the technical process and the infrastructure behind that process impacts our movement partners just as much as our programs do. So today is an attempt for us to lift the curtain behind what it takes to move the money. It's the ways that we are trying to give people insight into how our operations team does their work. And it's how we are starting to actually figure out what it looks like to do trust-based philanthropy. Trust is earned, it's not given, and it can't be assumed. And it's something that's maintained through our actions and how we consistently show up. Trust is determined by who our grantees know us to be through our actions, not through just our words and our pledges, but how we show up in community with them. And so with that, I am so excited to introduce and welcome on my amazing colleagues. We have Ray Holgado, who is the Director of Knowledge and Grants at the Kataly Foundation and leads our grants management team. We also have Danielle Royston Lopez, who is our Grants Program Associate. Thank you so much, and I can't wait for you guys to go through this conversation with them.
Hi, folks. I just want to thank you, Hamaka, for that wonderful introduction. As you stated, I'm the Director of Knowledge and Grants here at Kataly, Ray Holgado. My pronouns, he, him. I'm calling in today from Richmond, California, unceded Ohlone land. Before we kick things off, I want to pass it to my colleague, Danielle, to introduce herself and to give us a little bit of a run of show for today.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you all as well. My name is Danielle Royston Lopez. I use pronouns she and they, and joining you today from unceded Ramaytush Ohlone territory, otherwise known as San Francisco. And yeah, I'm the Grants and Program Associate here at Kataly. Today, we have a really great discussion ahead, including some time with a couple of Kataly grantee partners to talk about the pain points and aspirations of trust-based philanthropy and philanthropic relationships. And unfortunately, we were supposed to speak today with Nayoka Acevedo of the Andrus Family Fund, and she won't be able to join us. However, this will give us a little bit more time to have some more in-depth discussions, as well as to take a closer look, I think, at the practice and tools that the Kataly Grants Management team has on deck. So with that, Ray, I'll hand it over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Danielle. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you all this morning. I think, to begin, I just want to reiterate, as Amaka mentioned, the heaviness that we're entering this space with. The heavy heart that we have for the horrific events that occurred yesterday in Texas, for the senseless violence that occurred earlier this month in Buffalo, for the systematic attack on reproductive rights that we're witnessing in this country, for the continued war in Ukraine, right? I also want to just name the all too often unnamed instances of violence, conflict, and chaos that don't make it into our crowded and, all too bleak news cycle. I wish that I could say that today's discussion would offer some relief during these exceptionally difficult times. But what I will share is that I believe that our collective liberation, our collective salvation, is rooted in honest dialogue, reciprocal relationships, and the cultivation of genuine community. So today I'd like to invite you all to enter into community with us for 90 minutes of real talk. Kataly is a young foundation. We're definitely not here to pretend that we've solved philanthropy, I assure you. We're also not here to hide the messy parts, avoid the difficult questions, or to romanticize a sector that is at best morally complicated. If anything, I hope that today's session helps to advance some questions that we need to collectively interrogate in this sector, in the spirit of moving us a step closer towards that vision of genuine community. So let's jump in. Can we bring the slide up? Thanks, Daniel. To understand what's distinct, and I think, in my opinion, pretty special about Kataly's grant-making processes, it's important to reflect on how power and decision-making authority is typically distributed within institutions. Despite well-intentioned mission and vision statements that promote equity and trust-based partnerships with community, that's often in stark contrast to how power is distributed internally. And it makes us have to question who these institutions are actually designed to serve. So as we look at this graphic, you'll see that we have at the top, representing really where most of the power is seated, the board and trustees. Typically, the board exercises some level of authority over grant making. There are institutions where, at the most extreme, there's not a dollar that goes out without explicit board approval. This really puts executive leadership in a position where they are oftentimes beholden to that vision laid out by the board. And this can also be in tension with the expressed aims or desired mission of the organization, right? So you may have what the board is comfortable with versus what is necessary to affect actual change. And what this looks like in practice, I would say, is oftentimes, unfortunately, grants management operations kind of writ large are in a place in which they codify these power dynamics into processes, right? So what we're looking at, when we think of extensive reporting requirements, when we look at top-down grant approval processes, heavy-handed evaluation practices, right? What we're really talking about here is the codification of those power dynamics, right? We're talking about gatekeeping. And I think what's really integral is to consider, we have grants management and operations here, but you could see this as finance staff. This might be chief of staff. This might be, your director of programs. And in all honesty, this is the heart of the bureaucracy that we see oftentimes really take over foundations, and not for good intention or not for bad intention, right? I think this is often just the way that power dynamics plays out. And for some, I think this in some ways, many ways, I think that this comes down from this initial decision that the interests, the political will, the comfort of the board is seated above what is necessary and what is requested from affected community. The way that this plays out, I think, for program staff, oftentimes, is that they are in this position where they are now have to do the exercise of case making, in which within these narrowly defined parameters, they are both holding the tension of being in community, being in conversation and direct conversation with grantees and with affected community, holding space for that. And then within the parameters of the organization, what is possible. You will often hear in the field, talk of co-conspiring, this need for folks to co-conspire with affected community. And what we don't really sit with is the recognition that what we're asking folks to do is to conspire against the systems that we've erected, right? Like these are not naturally occurring. In many ways, it is, a direct downstream implication of the way that we have structured foundations often, right? So what I would say is, I think what for me has been a real special part of being part of Kataly is that Kataly's approach really comes from a recognition that this structure is flawed. A recognition that centering the interest and will of trustees over the needs and opinions of affected communities is a deeply flawed approach. I would say that Kataly in many ways is an audacious experiment in how we can invert this pyramid. It's the reason that we're a spin down foundation with the goal of expending our assets by 2030. It's also the reason our founding board has chosen not to exercise authority over the organization's grant making. And we really have to credit them for that decision because it has had huge implications for the work. Additionally, we have had the advantage of having a CEO that leads with trust and care. And I have to name that. I also have to say that, you probably can tell that Namaka is cut from a different cloth because there's not many executives that would have me out here talking off script. So I think that's a large part of it too, right? We're trying something a little different here. And I appreciate that every day. So, ultimately, the trust that the board and our leader has extended creates a spaciousness for how we orient ourselves to this work. And the way that this is played out for grants management, I would say more broadly, operations, is that we are in a position to really orient ourselves to our true constituents. So I don't need to seat the will and desire of the board and the executive over our grantees. Danielle and myself, we work in service of our grantees. And by extension, we work in service of our program staff because we understand that they are doing the deep and hard work of building those relationships. They are the tip of the spear in building that genuine community with our grantees. And we'll oftentimes talk about Kataly's relational approach. And it's one of those things that is fairly ambiguous, hard to pin down, but something that you feel. And I'd love to pass it over actually to my colleague Danielle to bring us into a little bit more of what that looks like in practice.
Thanks, Ray. Really appreciate you setting up the introduction. And it's my pleasure to be talking a little bit more concretely with everyone today about Kataly's relational approach. I think that, it is, as Ray mentioned, very hard to pin down. Relationships take time and they take effort. And there are small shows of trust, of understanding, of listening, of presence. I think that can not all be codified into, let's say, a strategy or a 3-point plan. However, I think that there are some really key parts of what makes the approach to grants management at Kataly very special. And so a few of the things are really starting with the rooting in right relationship. So Kataly really centers the self-determination of Black and Brown community groups in our mission and our vision, and therefore in our practice. And so what this really looks like is at every point and every turn of creating systems and structures of grants administration, we do ask ourselves who is at the center of the decision-making process, or who is at the center of the experience of the process itself. And if there are ever times where we find ourselves in a learning position of saying, oh, maybe I'm at the center here rather than the grantee, or who's not in the room, who's not at the table. This process of asking questions really helps us to continue to strive for right relationship in the way we set up our grants administration processes. The other piece is around the prioritization of responsive care as opposed to ease and flexibility for our grantees. And the reason that I really make a distinguishment between responsive care and ease is that what is easy for me may not be easy for someone else, whether that is a team member internally, whether that is a grantee. And ease is very subjective. And so rather, we really lean into asking the questions of how can we be responsive to not just the needs, but also the strengths and aspirations of grantee partners and the communities that we seek to serve. Another piece is around coming from a place of yes, and this is also coming from a place of trust. An example might be that if there's a unique need that's uplifted to the grants management team, we recognize our positionality in the chart that Ray had gone through just a moment ago, and realize that we can really change the way that we respond to unique needs when things arise, when crisis happens. And say, rather than coming from a place of wanting to protect ourselves or protect our own interests or the interests of the institution of philanthropy, we say, how can we lean into flexibility? At least give it a try. Say yes, and then learn from the process that we go through and what actually happens, and use that as feedback for how we respond in the future. This builds trust not only with our grant partners, but also with the program staff as well, because then they're able to really pass along that place of yes to the grantee partners, and builds trust throughout the organization and our ecosystem. Another thing that we really try to strive for as well and ask questions around is how can we create systems that are asset-based, that are accessible, and that are appropriate? And how do we create systems that center the unique realities of each grantee? A really great example of this that we might get some time to go more in depth about has to do with tools and technology. And so I won't speak to it too much here, but when we're setting up a technological platform, whether that's a grantee portal or a grant application form, really thinking about how can we lean into the strengths that a grantee partner has, how can we make the forms or the tools as accessible as possible, but also make them appropriate. This can look like changing reporting requirements, for example, from a 10-page paper report to a conversation over the phone. And that can really lean into the strengths and the community knowledge and wisdom and way of communicating that is also more conducive to practicing understanding relationship. And then finally, this extension of trust and care and flexibility has to happen within our own institution in order for it to even touch the relationships that we have with our grantee partners. By exercising the coming from a place of yes, and by also leaning into the strengths that our teams present, we're able to then foster an internal culture that really ripples outward very well. And so this is some of the facets of what a relational approach can look like at the Kataly Foundation. And so as we're thinking about this kind of approach to grants management and the infrastructure and tools we use, one of the pieces that's also very clear and necessary is the intentionality that we have to hold around hearing feedback from our grantee partners in order to collaborate and be in conversation. And so that is why today I'm very excited to announce that we've invited 2 of our grantee partners to be in conversation with us about the pain points that are experienced as they have applied for or received funding, and also the hopes that they hold to reimagine relationships with funders at the grants administration level. And so I would love to welcome and invite Denise Perry and Karina Gold to come on video and join us. We'll have a discussion about these topics. It's a pleasure to have you both with us today. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your time and your presence. And I want to go ahead and open us up with introductions first and foremost. And Karina, I'm wondering if you would like to go first and take some time to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here today. Thank you for that opening and the framing of the conversation this morning. Horshe Tuhi Ka'at Lashanka Ka'at Ra'at Karina. My name is Karina Gould. I am the co-founder and co-director of the Segurite Land Trust, the first urban Indigenous women-led land trust in the country. And, you know, I started this work not as a land trust, but as a person that is rooted in my land. And so I am Lashawn, and the territory of my ancestors is the East Bay. And the mountain behind me is called Tuyshtak, and Tuyshtak is our creation story, what is now known as Mount Diablo. I started this work many years ago doing sacred sites protection work and the protection of our ancestral places in the Bay Area. And most people don't know where those places are because they've been obliterated by buildings around our land base. And so Janella LaRose and I started this land trust about 6 years ago or so, because there was a need for us to find out, how do we re-engage in land again? As Indigenous women, how do we bring back this circle of care that has been wiped away through colonization? And how do we begin to re-engage our people that have been brought here through forced relocation policies, and the Lashawn people who have found themselves homeless in our own homelands? We also were trying to figure out, how do we re-engage in bringing our ancestors home from these institutions that hold our ancestors hostage in basements and in facilities that we don't have access to. UC Berkeley holds over 9,000 of our ancestral remains. Many of the institutions around the Bay Area hold many as well. And the dream was to bring them home and to give them a place to rest again, that they should be in the land. But as we continue to pray about this for many years with people from all walks of life, we found that we, again, we're homeless in our own homeland. How do you rebury thousands and thousands of ancestors with no land to put them back into? And how do we begin to re-engage in the land the way that our ancestors had originally taught us to? How do we become part of the land again? What is our responsibility to our waterways and to the land that has given an abundance to us for thousands and thousands of years? And then how do we share that with those that now live in our territory? People that have made this their home, people from all walks of life and all intersections that call the Bay Area home now. How do we share that knowledge and become good hosts again? In our traditional ways, a good host means that we take care of people that are on our lands, that we make sure that there's enough food, that we make sure that there's shelter, that we make sure there's good waters. And that for thousands of years, that's how the Bay Area was. We imagine a couple of 100 years ago that every waterway that is now culverted had fresh water that you could drink out of. And now we can't see those. And those ecosystems are destroyed. And how do we bring those back? How do we say, as a good guest in our territories and our lands, it's now our shared responsibility to take care of the lands we're on in order to make sure there's abundance for the next 7 generations and beyond. And so really that's what the Land Trust is about. It's about creating those spaces, not just for Lashawn people or not just for Indigenous people, but for all people that now live in our territory. How do we build relationships so that we remember how to be human beings again? How do we remember that a few hundred years ago, there was no concept of hunger or homelessness in this land? And now we look out and we see something much different in this landscape. And so it's about us reimagining the Bay Area. It's about going backwards in order to go forwards. It's about going together with everyone that now lives here. And so the Segurite Land Trust is really about that. It's about creating relationships with people that now live in our territory. And it's important, it's a women-led land trust, an Indigenous women-led land trust that has leadership also from Lashon people, but also it's important for us to look at how has our leadership as women become distorted or taken away? How does it correlate with what has happened to the land and the world? How is it that the same thing that happens to the body, the body of our lands and waters, the extraction and the rape and the destruction and the sacredness being taken also happened to women's bodies? And so it really is about bringing us back to the center again, reimagining what it looks like to follow Indigenous leadership and women's leadership in a place that will take us beyond through this crisis of climate disaster. And so that work is really what has really pushed us. We work, of course, with Indigenous people from all walks of life, men and women, working on our crew to take care of little plots of land, to heal that land and to re-engage other people in our territories to do that work with us. And so it's been an amazing journey that I hadn't expected to take, but I kind of fell back. I told my ancestors to catch me, and they have. And we have been doing this work, and it has been a great blessing to do that. So thank you so much for bringing me into this conversation.
Thank you so much, Karina. It is a real pleasure to have you with us. And Denise, I would love to offer the same invitation to you if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I just want to say it's an honor to be in this conversation with Karina. So much respect for your work and what you all are creating and making happen. I'm also a co-founder and director of BOLD, Black Organizing for Leadership and Dignity. And our work came to be as we looked at the history of organizing, the history of the most impactful shifts that have happened in this country, so much of which had been led by the civil rights movement with Black folks. And what we recognized was that the leadership and the organizing training that existed wasn't really speaking to the needs, the experiences, and the work of Black organizers and Black directors, Black leadership. And so we thought we would step in and make that possible. And this is our 10th year. And for 10 years, we have been doing work at the intersection of personal transformation, leadership, development, helping people build political education, both for themselves and inside of their organizations. And now really sort of looking at where is this having impact and making shifts. So we're doing a lot of evaluative work in that process. I recognize that two things I didn't say. Where I'm at, I am in Tequesta territory here in South Florida, specifically now known as North Miami. And yeah, I also just want to acknowledge just the power of Kataly. And for me, that comes from Amaka, having known Amaka and worked with her, and just want to say that an organization is a reflection of its leadership. And I really appreciate where you all have been, where you're going, and honored to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Denise, and thank you both so much for being here today. I'm really excited to dive into the discussion that we have. I just want to remind our attendees of the webinar today that if you have any questions, you can also drop them into the Q&A function. So please let us know if you have any questions at all as we're kind of going about this discussion today. And so, yeah, I think Denise, Karina, if we're ready, let's jump right in. I'm hoping that we can kind of just, have a discussion, jump in with our ideas. Feel free to ask follow-up questions, the whole thing. And of course, do care for yourselves in the space. So drink water, see what you got to do. This should be fun. Okay, so when we're talking about, grant making processes, I know Ray and I kind of laid out this very kind of like big set of context and different things that Kataly is doing, exploring, asking questions about, being curious about. And it, like many institutions and the institution of philanthropy in particular, and like many foundations, I think that, doing philanthropy and making grants comes from a good place, right? There's this intention of wanting to do the right thing, of wanting to show up well. And sometimes the impact can be different. As we know, intent and impact don't always match up. And so I'm wondering if we could start off by really speaking to some of the challenges of grant making processes that you've experienced, and maybe where you've observed there's been a mismatch between funders' intentions and the actual impact that it's had on you, your organizations, or your communities as you've gone through different grants management processes, from applying for grants or even after receiving grants, what that process was like. Denise, I see a small nod in your head. Would you like to jump in first?
Sure, I'm happy to go first. So many things. There's that old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And that feels a little present here. And I would say that the lack of coordination amongst the foundation world in philanthropy is what makes this just such a tiring process on our end. And that is, everyone has their own grant process and questions and portals and what you need to do when and how. And if you are an organization that runs at about a 500K budget, let's say, that's at least 10 different funders, at the least, that you are chasing their systems. And if your organization is running at that, depending on what your staff makeup is, for me, I always felt like I needed more organizers than I need administration, because my agenda is about change and building power. That means as an ED, you're running around like a mad person trying to do so many things. And so I think the lack of coordination, I recall back in the day, there was, I believe it was through NFG, that there was a single application form that you could fill out for any of the members in that. But that, that difference across the board is just sort of like the introduction to confusion and frustration. And I think that begins the process around what becomes performative and what becomes building real grounded relationships, because of the demand and the timing and all of those things is just really, I would put out there as probably my number one concern. And on top of that, I always wonder just sort of like how organized is philanthropy, because its processes also set up such a deep competition that is pretty unnerving, and I think really gets in the way of us accomplishing our ultimate goals of liberation and wellness and all of the things that we're out here struggling for. And I'll pause there, make room.
Those are some fantastic points. Karina, I'm curious to know what you think about what Denise has said. I also have follow-up questions too, but please jump in.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Denise. It's so wonderful to be in conversation with you. When you talked about competition, that just like boom, like in my, yeah, it's just like I was like, oh my God, because in our community, in the Native community, we're always, because we're one of the smallest communities that get funding from philanthropy in the country across the board. When it comes to that competition place, and in the Bay Area, there's multiple Native groups, organizations are always in competition with other people. I wouldn't say Segurite is in that position right now, but I have worked for nonprofits my entire life. And it was always about competitions with other organizations that were doing similar work and who was going to be the person or the group that got that grant. And I think so for real, that's a real concern about what does that look like and how do you build relationships. And a lot of times it's like, it's not building relationships. I have noticed that in past times when I was dealing with foundations, it was really about doing a lot of cold calls. It was really about trying to put your application grant in there and crossing your fingers and hoping that you had money for the staff. When you're doing nonprofit work, it's always going from grant to grant, and that it's not sustainable all the time, and that you have to change sometimes within the organization. You have to change people's positions, and because of the granting, the monies that you're getting from grantors, from foundations, that it doesn't always fit, but you're trying to make it fit so you can keep people employed that are doing good work. And so that makes you have to rethink and reimagine what it is that you're doing, and try to stay true to your mission, while also fitting within the mission of these foundations that are similar but not quite the right match. And I think that's kind of been one of the things that I've seen many nonprofits go through. Many of the organizations that I used to work for had to do that, trying to figure out how it was going to fit in order for you to keep people on. And that's a big worry for a director of an organization, to have to worry about employees being paid, and trying to fit into these things. I remember when we were having a pre-conversation, I talked about how foundations had there was a time when the nuclear war things were really up, and that was the thing to fund. And it was around philanthropy. Everybody was throwing money at this, which was great. But then when it wasn't the big idea anymore, all of that money went away. And so all of these organizations fell apart because there was no sustaining grants in order to keep them afloat. And the work was really specific to doing that nuclear proliferation work. And so I think when there's a hot idea and many foundations jump on that, rather than doing the work of giving general grants, there are specific grants around projects. The project work goes away, and then people just go away. And that's not kind of how the world works. The world does not work in those kind of silos of hot topics, that there are things on the ground that need to continuously be worked on. And I think that foundations sometimes are not close to the people on the ground and what is happening on the ground, but see these bigger ideas that they would like to work on, and would like to have these organizations do that kind of work for them. So I think that's one of the biggest things that I have seen, that there's the lack of communication and the lack of knowledge or trust. That if you are working with an organization that you have trusted in and built some kind of a relationship with, that it's important to have a conversation with them as real people. One of the bad experiences I had in the last 6 years, or 5 or 6 years, was that we had a grant manager who wanted to do that, engage, but then became this person that nobody wanted to see when they came through the door, because they took up a lot of time in negative kind of ways, like going through your website and telling you what was wrong and how you should redesign it, and not giving you anything that was positive about how to do that kind of work, or the funding to do that, because websites are a lot of money to do a really good one. How to engage with people. So they really wanted to micromanage how you were doing the work, and it became really a barrier to even wanting to go for the foundational grants that you really needed to do the work. So I think that was one of the things I saw as well. I'm going to stop talking.
Thank you so much. And I see so much resonance as well in the chat with everything that you both are saying. And I mean, there's this piece around, like micromanagement, but also the lack of coordination. And it seems like the disconnect when we're talking about sustainability and long-term sustainability of movements, of communities, that it seems, foundations don't really get right at times. I'm really struck by also, Denise, to your point about competition and how, I think that there is this sort of disconnect that can occur that really ends up pitting movement groups against each other, when if we were to work as a collective, that would be, so much more impactful. And so I wonder if I can ask a quick follow-up question about these challenges. When I hear the challenges that you've both raised, I really hear conversations that have the underpinning of a very deep conversation about power and how, for foundations, for the institution of philanthropy, we're sitting in a space of holding a great amount of resource and also a great amount of decision-making power around how movement groups are able to operate, whether that is, in having project-specific grants versus general operating, and the kind of way that can sometimes tie the hands of movement groups. I'm wondering, what would you suggest as sort of like food for thought for folks as we think about, the questions of power, and what are the things that foundations should be asking themselves, or maybe kind of waking up to in your experiences, that could help to maybe shift that? And even, what does a shift look like? I recognize that's 3 questions in one, but I'm riffing here. What do you think?
So a couple things came to mind as you were saying that, and I believe it is, the first question is sort of, who is leading? And so often we're getting whipped around as the flavor of the month, when we will get resources and when we won't. And I also feel like there is just it's in the triangle that you put up around power, right? And if that board of trustees then is really who is leading, because they're ultimately making the decisions, what is, or is there any political alignment with that? And that the ability for us to discern as organizations whether we even want to go after money from them, because that is going to mean a very particular sort of leverage on what we can do, how we do it, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there is maybe a little bit of a dual responsibility in that. And then the other piece that it's making me think about is just this demands then more, and I know Kataly does this, more advisors that are from the field of organizing to be engaged in the process. I have been an advisor for different foundations, and I think it's just a really important role. I mean, if people aren't coming to actually witness and be in and understand the work, it makes it, it's so just judgments that are not assessments, right? There's a very clear difference of, I have an assessment of the conditions versus I have a judgment of what I want to do as this board of trustees and what's good for my bottom line. And the final thing I will say is, and how is 5% of my giving impacting where I'm going and what I'm doing? I think if you believe in something, even the best gambler says at a certain point, 5% is not going to win the game. So, let me ante up. So yeah, I'll stop there.
I just appreciate you, Denise, I think. I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the way that you put things together. I love that. Um, I think some of the best the best foundations that I have had relationships with were those that have actually come to see the work, that have actually spent time, like quality time, not just like I'm going to drop in for a half an hour, but come and spend some time with us and see what the work and dream with us. Let us dream together what this could be. If we could just put aside all of the structures, if we could put away all of those kinds of hierarchies, let's sit down together and let's dream. Let's see where we've been, and then it becomes a personal relationship, right? That someone comes out to the land with us, that someone actually has participated in an event, that someone actually has experienced that themselves, that it becomes something much bigger and deeper. And it is really about that relationship building of seeing each other as human beings and not seeing each other as a piece of paper or something in a portal or even a picture, right? That you're able to do that. So some of the best relationships that I have are with foundations that actually do that, that spend the time. Kataly does that. Other foundations have done that. That asks our opinions about stuff. People that actually work at foundations and reach out to us and say, "Could you please apply for this because this actually fits you?" Because it might not be on our radar. We might be too busy doing other things. And then to sit down and say, let's go through this together and let's answer these questions together. And then let's figure that how best to answer the questions. That actually helped me out a great deal. When I was really sick one time, a few years ago, I had somebody from a foundation contact me and I couldn't take the call. And they were persistent in getting a hold of me until we did walk me through the process. And so that was an amazing experience that we built that relationship. I trusted this person. We built a better relationship because of that, because they knew that this was something that they could do and how they could help. And I believe that there are people that are in philanthropy, that are in organizations around that want to do this work and understand how to do it. There are foundations that have been here in the Bay Area that realized that something about philanthropy was not working in their foundation. And they sat down with all of their grantees in 2 separate days. They had rooms full and just began to ask these questions about what could be different. How can we change the way that we're funding people? What are those, what would help you do that? And they changed the way that their foundation was doing work with the communities that they served. And I think that that's important, that when for people to realize that within your own organization, that there has to be a different way of doing this. We've done this like this for a lot of years, and maybe this isn't the best way to do it. Maybe we can talk to other foundations like Kataly and find out how are they doing it? How do they build relationships? How do we continue to see each other as human beings? And I think that that's the basis of our work as community organizers. That is the basis of our work, is building relationships. And it has to be the basis of how we also engage with each other. And so that there's not so much of this hierarchy. I remember when I was a young person and we had people from foundations coming to visit our organization. And I would be nervous, right? About, oh, these are the people that are going to give us money. If we mess up, we're not going to get this money, right? As a young person, I felt even that hierarchy there. And people shouldn't have to feel that way. People should just be able to talk like we're talking today, and be able to build those relationships and see each other like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I do kind of want to pivot us a little bit towards, the conversation of trust-based philanthropy. And Karina, I think that you've definitely set up a lot of really beautiful examples of what it could look like for us to be in real relationship with each other as funders and as movement groups. And also, where are some areas where you think that trust-based philanthropy doesn't quite get it right? What are the pitfalls? And I want to steer specifically towards an example around lack of process, which I think that lack of coordination was definitely mentioned before. But I think sometimes and often in the actual practice of trust-based philanthropy, funders and foundations and grants administrators especially can say, oh, I'm not going to, ask any questions. I'm going to be very hands off. I'm going to stand all the way back here, let the movement do the work that it's going to do. And I'm going to be so out of the way that there's actually not much going on between us. And I'm wondering if you can speak to either your experiences with that or any other kind of pitfalls of what seems like it's trust-based, but might actually just be more hands-off.
Yeah, that's funny that you say that. I need to also say that I'm privileged enough to be in an organization where I'm not the ED and raising money. And I know that is not true for most people. And so I want to recognize the team of folks at Bold who do that work, and that I aim to support them. And I think when I witness, because I did do the fundraising and clean the bathroom and all the things for many, many years. But I think there is that little bit of, it's a little bit of almost like mind game, right? It's like the Oz behind the curtain feeling to be like, well, just answer these, geographic questions in your banking information and we'll catch you next year. And it's like, okay, but I'm not sure what that really means. And I think, again, depending on where your resource line is, right? Am I comfortable? Can I just move on and be like, cool, right? Or for most organizations, it's a little tense, right? Like they're immediately thinking about the next round of grants. And so again, I think these kinds of lack of communication and clarity and political alignment that is clear generates a performative that then isn't true oftentimes, right? And I'm not saying that we're out here lying to people, but you're asking for me to tell you stories, right? By not giving me some direction. And I think there is also just what happens in that is the lack of process and structure then tells me you're not looking at the infrastructure needs that we have, which is fundamentally critical. So I've always been saying this idea of a piece of infrastructure that would be a game changer is purchase healthcare for everybody so that an organization doesn't have to grind and wring their hands about healthcare. If Paychex can offer a PEO to ensure that everyone who uses Paychex for their payroll has healthcare, certainly the kind of resources that exist in the world of philanthropy could provide healthcare. We're walking around trying to figure out how to get healthcare and giving people shitty little plans, excuse my language. Or, we have healthcare, but we don't have dental and eye. Well, that is still my health, but unfortunately the organization can't afford it. So I don't think we're being very imaginative as philanthropy around what are some just collective things that are available because of the deep pockets of resources. So I think we're aiming to be creative while having this sort of pressure lamp on us. And I feel like oftentimes the other side is a little narrow-minded.
Yes, absolutely. Karina, please jump in.
That's what dreaming looks like, Denise. Dream together. That doesn't look all sexy, paying for health care or child care.
Yeah.
Or any of those kinds of things. But it is a necessity in order to do the kinds of works that we want to do by all means. I think that the question Danielle raised was, what does it look like to be hands off rather than partners? I think that that's what we're looking at, right? It's like, I think that there needs to be more folks that give to more philanthropy dollars to go to general funding that allows people to do the work that they want to do. But I think that that is built on trust. And that sometimes there's not a conversation about trust. And so people are afraid to give that money to an organization or a person because that becomes a personal relationship and so they're afraid. It has to be project-based, and project-based isn't always the thing that's going to take care of the rent, or it's going to take care of the plumbing that needs to be fixed, or all of that. There's general funding that needs to happen in order for all of those mundane things to continue on so that the project work can happen as well. But I think that if people reach out and to build those relationships, they can find out that that it's a much richer and that there's accountability in building those relationships. There's an accountability because you're able to pick up the phone and say, how are you doing? Or I'd like to stop by, or can we have coffee? And can we find out what's going on? What are some of the needs that your organization has right now that we're not looking at? Or is there something that we can participate as an organization to come out and help to lift up the work that you're doing? I think that those are the kinds of dreams. When I look at philanthropy as a whole, I don't think any of the relationships I have right now, definitely not with Kataly, but when I'm looking at philanthropy, it's almost like this, and I'm just talking from my community, it's a paternalistic kind of relationship. Is that we know what's best for you. This is what we're going to give you. We'll give you $5,000 rather than $50,000 because we want to make sure that you don't mess up this money, right? And so that has been my experience in the past with philanthropy, is that we'll give you a little bit because we don't know who your community is. We don't know who you are. We have this colonial idea and mindset about who you are as a people. And we hold on to that rather than to build the relationships. And so it really is about beginning to have those conversations with people and seeing them again. You know, even today when we was writing in land acknowledgements, that happened only about in the last 6 years or so, right? And it was really because we as a community pushed that, and we came from other indigenous communities in different parts of the world about why that was important. But that wasn't in our mindset. And today we're all doing that. People from all over the country are writing where they're from, whose land they're on, and understanding that relationship. And so understanding that relationship, that land acknowledgement, this philanthropy world has to go beyond that land acknowledgement and understanding their relationship to the people that are on the lands that they're on, both indigenous people and other people that are doing that work on the ground. And so I think that that's one way we can begin to frame our minds. It's like, we understand this now. This is something that was new that came in. People are understanding that concept now. And so now what's the next step to build those relationships?
Yes, absolutely, definitely. And kind of segueing right into what does it look like to rebuild or build those relationships? I wonder, in the last couple of minutes that we have, could you both speak to how you want to reimagine relationships with funders and with philanthropy at the grants administration level? What does it look like?
I feel like we've kind of dropped them in along the way, but I feel like the really drawing the expertise from people who do this work, so having them engaged as advisors, or some, I'm using that term just because it's short and sweet, but what would be a role that they could play in the process of connecting and building and understanding and strategizing. I think this spend down, like, commit to what it is that you want to win, and versus your lasting forever, because that is that tension around capitalism and what we're struggling from because of it. I think there are parts of the infrastructure that need to be invested in that may not necessarily have to be in grant making. It could be purchasing buildings, right? Like, we are community organizers, and so many organizations are spending so much of their money on rent. I mean, gentrification, hello, right? Like, these are supposed to be business smart investors that are these foundations, yet we're out here toiling and giving money away to gentrifying entities. That makes zero sense. So let's be for real and invest in real estate. I come out of the labor movement, and I've never worked in a local union that didn't own their own building. What is the part of our work is also about building and understanding governance. And so that means if the foundation actually believes in the organization, that is part of that is our ability to govern, which means we need the resources. And so letting go and allowing governance to take place. Those are a couple off the top, but Karina, I know you got more. I could go on and on, but I try and keep it together here.
No, I love that. I think that when you talk about owning a building, that means that you are stable in your community. When you're able to be in your community, that you become that touchstone in your community where people know that there's going to be a long history. And I think that I really love that when we're talking about gentrification. And I live in the Bay Area, one of the most expensive places in the world to live. And I talk about being at the beginning, about being homeless in our own homeland, even though this land. And so it really is about beginning to figure out how do we root ourselves in those communities in that way where we're not packing up and having to leave. That brings up trauma for a lot of people of color, because we've always had to move, right? And in order for us to stay permanent someplace is an amazing thing. So to begin to think about that in a deeper way of what does that mean to do that. I think I'm losing my track of my mind. I'm gonna not my mind, but I'm losing my track. So I'm gonna stop for a second.
Oh, good. No.
Yeah, and I do want to say in the ownership, I went very quickly there, but I think whatever that might look like, right? Shared space with multiple organizations. I know we have a couple of places here in South Florida where folks have been able to make that happen. Because our communities deserve to have their own space.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I wish that we had more time to be able to dive into a lot of the really great points that you've both made. Denise and Karina, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. And please do stick around because I think we'll have a few minutes for Q&A. But I do want to transition us over to do a quick talk about Kataly's next steps and some practices and tools. So thank you again, Denise and Karina. Much appreciation to you both.
Ooh, I feel like, I just want to say that this conversation, this webinar has basically peaked. That is going to be the portion. More than anything, just deep appreciation for the wisdom and truth telling of our panelists today, but also for the grounding in a place of hope, right? I think that more than anything right now, there is always this sense of hopelessness, not just for this work, but just where we are in the world. It's really refreshing to hear how we can continue to move forward, how we've made progress, and to really have that keen insight about where we need to continue to press those levers. So I think, speaking to Danielle's point, this section of our session really could be titled the complexities we're still navigating, right? In large part, as we look at the practices and tools that we utilize at Kataly, I'm often reminded of the often quoted Audre Lorde around, the master's tools cannot be used to dismantle the master's house, right? And I think what I sit with is that ultimately, and I think Karina and Denise both spoke to this, is that we are living in a world that is in dire condition because of extractive capitalism. That is the analysis of many of us. I think that is an analysis that we hold very closely at Kataly. And yet we are tasked with using capital to hopefully stem that tide, using capital to help folks meet the material needs of today, right? And that is work that is complicated, work that comes with complexity. So as we look at the various tools of philanthropy, we have to sit with the recognition that many of these tools are often misused, that many of these tools come out of a history of being used to bludgeon the communities that we hope to serve, right? What I will kind of start with, and then we're going to keep this pretty conversational between me and Danielle, but one thing I did want to uplift is that, one of the early decisions that Kataly had to come to was around donor advised funds. For those who know, they're super efficient vehicles for moving funding, often used by individual donors. Foundations in recent years have become more and more reliant on them. They add an efficiency gain and an ease of use for grantees. Now, the critique against donor advised funds, a very legitimate critique, is that it is, to the earlier point, a good way of kind of avoiding that 5% spin down that a foundation under its typical setup would be required to do. And already 5% is not enough. We know that, right? So the idea of kind of sheltering your dollars in these pseudo bank accounts, where you don't necessarily have to even spin down at the 5% level, it's problematic. More problematic is the fact that these donor advised funds, for the most part, are owned and operated by large institutions, large banking firms, right? And oftentimes these accounts are set up in such a way to incentivize folks leaving their money there, right? Like the annualized fees on these accounts for these firms ensure that their business is very much tied up in folks allowing their money to sit. And I think as we approach this work, we're both holding the tension of we're going to be here for 10 years. It is to some extent, right, a zero-sum game. So we could staff up right now. It's me and Danielle who hold down the grants management side of the business, right? But we could say, hey, well, let's have our internal grants management, right? And we could do a team of 5, right? But that would take an enormous amount of funds away from affected community. So I think, we started from a place of trying to understand how to balance those two things, how to balance those two needs. And I'm really happy to report that, and I think this is one of those learnings where we have an opportunity to radically reimagine the way that some of these tools are used, right? So we've had the opportunity to partner rather recently with Possibility Labs. For those of you all who know, they're a relatively new firm that's BIPOC led, that holds donor advised funds for organizations and individual donors. And part of what's really attractive about their model is that, rather than having this annualized fee, you pay upfront. So as funds go in, you pay a percentage. And that's super useful for a few reasons, right? There's no incentive for Possibility Labs to have our funds sit for extended periods of time. They are both politically and socially aligned in understanding that these dollars need to be moved to community. And they haven't wrapped their business interests up in kind of that duality of we're here to serve the public good, but also if you leave your money here, that would probably be best for us from a business standpoint. And I share that only to say really, that's not a one size fits all approach. I don't think that all organizations, that this is our approach that will work for, but I would say that this is where we need to start getting a little bit inventive. Because, had you asked me 2-3 years ago how I felt about donor advised funds, I would have a drastically different answer. And I think, to Karina and Denise's point, there is progress, but you need to seek it out. You need to find those folks who are in alignment with you in your rationale and reasoning about how you want to do this work. And oftentimes also, you may need to be willing to pony up the dollars to help build that capacity, to enter into partnerships and build a path forward. It is insufficient for us to simply sit with where philanthropy is today and say it is what it is. I know someone had recently just dropped in its chat about the New Yorker article that came out, the kind of substantive takeaway being that philanthropy is at its root anti-democratic. I don't feel that is something that we are in a position to defend or a reality that I would say is unjustified, right? But what I will say is that it is a measure of more or less, right? It is a spectrum. Decentering the interests of founders, of boards, of trustees does a lot to solve for that issue as well. It is not uncommon or impossible to imagine philanthropy that operates within a community governance model. So there is nothing about philanthropy in itself that is anti-democratic. It is the institutions that we've created. It is the inverted pyramid that we've allowed to kind of take hold of this industry. As we look at extractive capitalism, as we look at a just transition to what the world can be, this is the complexity of the work. We're not going to wave our magic wand and kind of have the world we want. We have to work through these intricacies. So I'll pass it over to Danielle so that we can kind of dive into some of the other intricacies that we're managing right now and share a little bit about the work that's ahead of us.
Yes, and in the interest of time, I am going to breeze through these a little bit quickly, but if you have questions, don't worry, there will be some time for follow-up. A couple of the additional practices and tools that are listed on this slide that I just wanted to highlight very quickly, and that I think I was able to highlight more so as well at the beginning of the webinar, really are around utilizing tools and technology and pairing it with a highly facilitated and supported approach. And I think this is something that, we at Kataly are exercising, especially again, in working with different platforms, with forms for applications, and how we engage with grantees in an increasingly virtual world. I think that this is one of those areas where we have had the learning that really pairing a beautifully seamless tool with little to no communication is not necessarily the best way to go ahead and facilitate it, but rather by taking the time to communicate, we have found that creates a network of support, a line of communication, and really, again, an opportunity to build trust with grantees. So whether that's with technical assistance, with understanding what's coming next once they complete a form and have to move to the next phase of receiving a grant, where they're all along the way to be able to ensure that process really has the grantee feeling held and not in limbo. So that's one of the pieces around technology that I wanted to highlight very quickly. And then lastly, too, speaking to creating trust internally so that it really does kind of ripple out in these circles of community that we're participating in. Developing collaboration points and feedback strategies with program officers has proven to be highly effective. And we do that in very ad hoc ways, where we have a grants management office hour, as well as the grants and programs team lead meeting, where we talk about kind of like bigger decisions that are coming down the pipeline. And one of them being, and I'll give just a very brief peek into this, we could honestly have an entire webinar about this, but Kataly is holding the question of how to approach the complexity of evaluation. We are trying to look at some key data points and really trying to hold the complex and challenging history, I think, of evaluation and what that's looked like in philanthropy, but also in the nonprofit industrial complex, as well as in other institutions that have kind of used philanthropy have used evaluation as a guise for wanting to help communities, but has also done some real harm. And so we're asking really big questions around that, around how do we center an evaluation that's focused on our self-accountability? How do we explore engaging with grantees? How do we do the work in partnership rather than kind of like from a high and far off place, as has long been done in the past? We're also working on a one-pager to really get clear with ourselves and also with our communities around the rationale behind the questions that we do want to ask and that we feel are appropriate for evaluating whether or not Kataly is being accountable to its mission. And we really strongly believe that if we can't back up, the questions that we're trying to ask with any rationale, that we probably shouldn't ask them. It brings us back to the question of who is evaluation for, what end does it actually serve, and how can we center, again, the needs and aspirations and self-determination of community groups through this process. And so it's very much in the works. There are way more questions than answers, but something that's really on the horizon, and we hope to be able to follow up in the future with more feedback on our practice. And so with that, I think we are going to jump into questions and answers, which I'm very excited about, and want to go ahead and invite our panelists, Denise and Karina. You're welcome to join us, and we'll jump right in. Okay, so there are a lot of really great questions here, and I think that we'll go ahead and begin with the first question that's come up. So one of our attendees has a question around sharing moments. Let's see. Okay, one of our listeners has come up with a question around how to balance the relational approach in philanthropy with the possibility of either voyeurism or micromanaging in spaces that aren't necessarily meant for folks who are not part of the community. That power dynamic is very real. And I wonder, Karina, would you like to speak to that question first? And then Denise, would you like to chime in as well?
I like that. No voyeurism. I had built a relationship with someone in a foundation for over many years. They had been given us small grants that kept us afloat for a long time while we were getting our 501c3, and then wanted to build the relationship better and asked if there was a time for both them and their finance director to come over and to have a conversation and to actually come onto the land. So we actually spent time and actually showed them around and had a conversation and began to dream about what could this look like. And then we went and grabbed sandwiches, and we went up to another piece of land that is a possibility of is being returned to us, and to dream about what could that look like if we began to take care of this land in a different way together, and how could we imagine the foundation building that relationship with us so that it's an ongoing relationship, that we understood that we could have long, what is it called, multiple year grants, where we can count on that because we knew that that was going to come, so that we wouldn't have the stress of having to worry about funding coming in. And it was that easy. It was like we still had to fill out the foundational stuff that they had. That wasn't something that we didn't have to do. We still had to do reporting, and then sometimes that reporting was a phone call, and sometimes it was actually sending in pictures, and sometimes it was coming out on the land and just seeing what was happening. But it was a relationship. It felt like, I knew somebody and that we could actually talk. that was a really good way of doing something. Didn't feel like voyeurism. It felt like I could actually talk to you and you can see this and experience this yourself. And it's not like something I have to write down in 5 pages and then you have this idea in your mind, but it's not real to you. And so it becomes a real thing. Similarly, I think I talked about somebody else that was from a foundation that came and was telling us how to do our work and how to change this. And it was really time consuming and it was an energy suck. And it was not fun to do that. And it happened to multiple organizations that that this person was a part of being their grants manager. And so it wasn't a good fit for our community. But, I think when I have the ability to sit and talk, and it's not an energy suck for me, at least, and I'm only talking from my experience, is that's what I want to do, is to build relationships. I want you to be able to see this work, and that there's amazing work that's happening, and it doesn't do justice sometimes to put it on paper and words, that you actually have to see it and feel it. And I also understand that, the grants folks that are in those offices in philanthropy they don't often have time to get out because they're doing other things. But if there's an opportunity for you to change around the way that you do your work so that you actually go out and meet people and talk to them and have coffee and to understand them and to see them, just so we see each other. We don't have enough time to do that. And I think it's the slowing down. And that doesn't happen very often in this world where we're on Zoom. Well, recently in the world, we've had to be on these Zoom conversations all the time, but that we're so busy with all these other things to actually sit and to talk to somebody and have coffee or to really be somewhere with them while the work is happening. It changes people's view of the work and it actually becomes real. And I think that's what's important.
Just wanted to add one thing there too, because I feel like something we've discussed here has been like the power dynamics at play, right? And a lot of this is, there is almost an unfair assumption that, grantee partners should hold that line, because of the power dynamics, because of the way that the capital is structured, right? So I also want to say, I think we need to, as people in philanthropy, as people who are trying to get this relationship piece right, we have to redefine what it means to be an ally to our partners, because funder to funder, sometimes that message comes out a little bit easier. Sometimes that can be a little clearer. And I think, part of that and part of the issue we have more broadly in the field is it's the lack of accountability. So more than anything, I guess I look forward to more spaces like this, more spaces where we can have these candid conversations. And a little bit less relativism and a little bit more objective, like maybe this is the way we need to move forward.
Yeah, if I can just make just a couple comments on this is, I think there's a class difference that we need to be honest about that may show up in this. I think people need to do their work because we sit in a role of privilege doesn't mean we also don't need to politically develop ourselves and understand how to engage with people or what the struggle is about, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think it gives you, I think you need to ask yourself, if I'm entering in this way, what is the work I need to do in order to be in this space? Just because I'm a funder doesn't mean I shouldn't be engaged in my own development and learning. And in our work at Bold, because we're in a training space and it's very personal and interpersonal, we don't allow funders or anyone to visit the space when we're in lessons because it's to protect the interest of the participants. These are directors. I mean, so we take responsibility for that, for the interest of the people in the group.
Thank you so much for all of your answers to this question. I'm really sitting with, Karina, what you said about changing the way we work in philanthropy, moving around the way that we work in order to make more time for relationship. And this brings me to another question that, Ray, I think I want to direct to you. And it sounds that it's coming from like the perspective of someone who may be in a philanthropic institution. But it says, thank you for sharing this framework. I'm curious if you could share about moments when this transformative framework has been in tension with the interpersonal habits we've learned by coming up through institutional philanthropy and how you've named and worked through that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think Alex put that in. Thank you, Danielle. This is something that is very much alive at Kataly. I will say, we often have conversations, and Zainab, our communications director, will definitely account for this, around this issue of unlearning, right? Like institutional philanthropy, as a career, especially for, people who come from various backgrounds, to Amaka's point, lived experience, I think we enter this field on tenuous ground, and we take what's given to us as kind of law, right? Like, this is how you do this job. And there is this process, once we start to try to invert that pyramid, of having to pull apart what is necessary. Now, I have the great kind of advantage of a team that's not afraid to let me know when something is like not necessary, or to question the why behind the processes we're building. And I think that what that also allows for is a space in which we are really in conversation. There is little that should be assumed about how this business should operate, because this business shouldn't exist, right? So I think that in large part, the willingness to radically reimagine, the understanding about the concessions that strategically we may need to make today, the tools we may need to use today in order to provide for the material needs of folks today, is one thing, but not losing sight of that North Star, not losing an understanding that there is something purer and better potentially on the horizon, if we're willing to do that very complicated work of sometimes sitting in hypocrisy, sometimes sitting in moments of real complexity with what we want to achieve, and what is possible today.
Thank you so much. And we are firmly out of time. This has been a full 90 minutes, and really just, I'm holding so much appreciation to everyone on this panel for your time, for your insights. And I'm going to hand it over to Zainab to close us out.
Yes, thank you so much, Ray, Danielle, Amaka, Karina, and Denise. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation and just sharing all of your insights and wisdom with us. This was really rich discussion, and loved seeing all the reflections in the chat as well. Just wanted to share that we will be sharing a recording of this webinar out shortly, early next week, along with just like some highlights and key insights that were shared. And we hope to try to address some of the questions that we weren't able to get to today in our follow-up blog post about the webinar. So thank you so much to everyone for coming into this space and for asking these great questions and for engaging with all of us. And we hope to share more soon.